Good afternoon. Wow. Today I'd like to discuss visibility, which I believe is the driver that really provides IT the ability to provide value to the business. With the proper tool sets in place, we can provide insight into operational networks that OT may not otherwise have, especially security-related events. A little bit about me. I'm the CISO for Noble Energy. I report to the CIO. I started with Noble about 5 years ago. Being new to oil and gas, I had a lot to learn in a short amount of time around what it meant to actually secure OT networks from risks that were entirely different from what I was used to. A quick overview of Noble. Let me make sure I got that. There we go. IT, right? So quick overview of Noble. We produce roughly 380,000 BOE a day. That's a barrel of oil equivalent. With over 1.4 billion BOE improved reserves. We have around 4,000 employees worldwide. We operate in 6 core areas, 3 onshore, the DJ, Permian Delaware, and Eagle Ford, and 3 offshore, the Gulf of Mexico, West Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically Israel. We've also announced recently an MLP for Noble Midstream, and my team is responsible for the cybersecurity of operations for both upstream and midstream. So given the fact that we operate in challenging locations from a geopolitical perspective, the risk profiles that we face from an that operations phase, I should say, is very unique, which makes that kind of pretty cool. So I'd like to start with what I believe is a pretty big disconnect between the expectations of boards and audit committees, mine included, around what's going on relative to OT cybersecurity. Many boards will look to the CIO for the state of cybersecurity, roughly 62%. So the issue is that OT teams like automation, measurement, and control, they don't report to the CIO, right? Normally those feed up through operations. Additionally, OT really doesn't have a say on how IT spend is allocated. So they don't really get a voice when it comes to what their requirements are for securing operations, with the assumption that they know what it means to secure operations. So if anything, the changes that IT makes, such as firewall rules, software deployments, and so on, has a negative impact on OT. So they're not really too interested in working with us, right? So it's more of the conversation of, it's not what you do for me, it's what you do to me that counts. So what I present to the board really has to encompass both OT and enterprise. So we had to kind of address this issue head on, and not just from a budgeting perspective, but from the vantage point of OT, right? Meeting and addressing their concerns, which brings me to my next point. To be successful in securing OT, we needed to first understand what it meant to properly do so. Reliability and integrity are the primary considerations, especially, so IT and similarly traditional IT security teams need to appreciate that significant difference. In our world, it's the typical CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. For ops, it's the exact opposite, right? Availability and uptime are the primary top priorities. So when it comes to introducing additional features into OT, it's critical to think about the net operational impact. Adding any additional component, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can create an impact that we simply didn't anticipate or expect. For instance, the traditional security solution tools, right? They don't really play nice in this field. So to the quote, the consequences of an operational shut-in are felt much more by operations, since they're the ones responsible for bringing production back online in a very coordinated, methodical fashion. Making sure OT knows that we as IT understand and appreciate their concerns is truly half the battle of engagement. The other half has to deal with the why. So how do we explain risks in terms that OT can truly understand? Well, I start with the financial impact and downtime. And to make that meaningful, I use quantitative methods with defined confidence intervals to describe the impact a cyber attack could have on OT. So we recently ran a cyber attack drill against a custody transfer, which is where we move ownership of hydrocarbons from Noble to our partners. So obviously, shut-ins aren't necessarily new. Actually, let me backtrack a little bit. So by the time we finished that drill, we confirmed that we could create an impact would range between $500,000 to $4 million, lower and upper bounds respectively, with a 90% confidence interval. In other words, I'm 90% sure that at the very least, this impact is going to cost $500,000, or at the very worst, it's going to cost $4 million. So obviously, shut-ins aren't new to them. Oh, by the way, that was at, let me see, I think it was at $50 barrel oil and about $2.50 gas, which is not where we are right now. So that number is probably higher. So obviously, shut-ins aren't necessarily new, and OT is very prepared for them, but they rarely take into account that a cyber attack could cause one. So running scenarios like this in our lab really helped to prove that out, and we didn't have to lose $1 million to do it. So, an example of a real-life threat was identified by Symantec, who stated, "The Dragonfly Group appears to be interested in both learning how energy facilities operate as well as gaining access to operational systems themselves, to the extent that the group now potentially has the ability to sabotage or gain control of these systems should it decide to do so." There's more recent and relevant attacks out there that are just as dangerous, including the Triton attack, which is specifically targeting safety instrumentation systems. This is the type of attack that could allow for an unsafe condition to escalate, leading to a potential accident or worse. I think some of the Dragos folks are here, so they could probably give you more detailed information on that. Also, I used, there's a book out there called How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity. That's what I used to help build out our Monte Carlo simulations to prove actual, escalated costs or expected losses. I highly recommend that book. Okay, so there's no doubt that operational environments are very complex systems. They're also hazardous. It's this very fact that drives creation of defenses against failure. A catastrophe in OT environments usually requires significantly more than just a single point of failure. Ed Crooks of the Financial Times, when talking about the BP Macondo disaster, referred to it as Swiss cheese. Hazardous activities are guarded against by multiple barriers, and so long as any failures are scattered throughout them, like holes in Swiss cheese, the system will avoid an accident. It's only when those holes are lined up that disaster strikes, which was certainly the case there. To that end, these systems operate in degraded mode with certain rising levels of entropy. They're using older hardware, older software, older operating systems, and so on. The type of stuff that you'd never see in a traditional, typical enterprise and would have been replaced long ago, right? And you'd be hard-pressed to find a millennial willing to work on Windows XP, for example. So that said, old hardware and software by themselves are really not so much the issue. It's rather the required connectedness that leaves them open to exploit. So, and addressing those vulnerabilities and risks is really where IT security teams can provide the most value, just so long as we remember that change of any kind introduces new forms of failure. So our goal is always do no harm and protect the process. To do that, we had to really know what was actually going on and what we're actually dealing with, seeing and gaining visibility and awareness into OT network traffic. We found the best way to do that is to monitor and inspect traffic utilizing a security platform capable of inspecting OT-specific protocols and devices. We do this by leveraging span ports to mirror traffic, and in some cases, hardwire taps for serial inspection. Either way, we're not interfering with production traffic at all. Right, so for us, researching the space and running multiple POCs, both in that lab that we talked about as well as on a production facility, the solution we chose was Clarity. And without sounding too salesy, I'll just say a couple of quick things. I found the integration to be fast and straightforward. It literally took us a few days to be up and running in learning mode. The feature set met our requirements globally. Onshore has a different security reference architecture than offshore for us, so it had to meet both requirements, and it did so. Secure remote access worked flawlessly for our OT teams, and we're actually now working with them to capture the metric as it relates to what they're able to gain with the quicker response and immediate addressing of issues. And also I've had the opportunity to work with their research and development team, and I really like what they're focused on, and I really like where they're headed. So it's a great group of folks that we take this partnership pretty seriously. So what do we gain by implementing the security platform into OT? Well, first, defense in depth, and we did that without impacting operations or causing any disruption. We're also identifying vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, which is a critical component to OT. Active monitoring, so real-time alerts creates faster response and continuous detection of industrial threats. The OT and IT integration, I talked about secure remote access, but the major component here is the shared investigative response. An example of that would be when we first deployed this in onshore, we have a very specific well that behaves in a unique fashion, and I think it's related to artificial lift. I'm not an engineer. And the process itself, when you look at it from a security perspective, it looks like a threat because it goes from warm reset to cold reset. And it does that every 5 minutes. Turns out that's the polling process of clearing the memory and kind of resetting it. I didn't know that, but it looked like a threat, and I was all panicky when I went to OT, and they kind of told me about it. So it was a good our shared investigative response, and our integration has grown substantially since deploying this. And finally, advanced analytics. ICS anomaly and threat detection, but most importantly, baselining of our environment so we can report on deviations from the means. Production's picked up a bit on this as well outside, beyond the control room, right? They can now validate changes that occur against their management of change. So this is a critical safety component. When they see changes and they don't line up to MOC, it's a great opportunity to go find out why. We've done some acquisitions along the way, especially during the downturn, which is always interesting, and this type of solution helped us identify those assets faster. And I say mean time to resolve versus repair because we're often trying to understand the root cause of an outage, right? And resolution really here is key. So it's been a very positive experience that has put IT in a much more strategic position relative to helping secure the bottom line. So what did we learn? Well, first we had to understand and quantify our risks. And we had to share that information with OT in a language that they can appreciate. It helps if you can produce this stuff in a lab, by the way, not in real life. This really isn't about adding security for the sake of security. It's, we wanted to prove that our goal was to avoid shut-ins caused by a cyber attack. We collectively suffer from a language barrier issue. So in order for us to explain the threats they face, we had to use their language. We in IT, we call ourselves networking and security engineers, but not in the traditional sense, right? I have a computer science background. I'm not a petroleum or electronical or mechanical engineer. So we needed to share the same language with the same meaning to drive effective change. 3, start simple. Pretty straightforward, right? See what's going on and then act. And we started with a platform that we believe can give us the best visibility into how our OT operates and then how we can help. Then define what you're trying to accomplish beyond visibility. Then we worked with OT to create meaningful metrics. We can't improve what we don't measure. And as we went through the deployment and its subsequent OT use, we continually improved our processes, specifically around incident response. A long way to go here, but it's a great first start. And then we've optimized the security solutions so that we really want to become transparent to operations. Because we believe that security should always be baked in and not bolted on, right? Because at that point it becomes a part of the attack surface. All right, so with that, I thank you very much for your time.